Welcome to Catholic Answers Live, the program where you participate with your questions about apologetics and evangelization, including the most important theological, spiritual, moral, and social issues facing the world today. Call now with your question for today's guest. Toll free 1-888-31-TRUTH. That's 888-318-7884. Now, from San Diego, Catholic Answers Live.
Oh, yes, indeed. Welcome to the show. This is Catholic Answers Live. It's Friday. He was born in 1509. He died in 1564 in Geneva. Charles Spurgeon said this of him. He said, "Among all those who have been born of women, there has not risen a greater than John Calvin. No age before him ever produced his equal, and no age afterwards has seen his rival. In theology, he stands alone, shining like a bright fixed star, while comets go streaming through space, with nothing like his glory or his permanence." That was Charles Spurgeon, famous American preacher, talking about John Calvin. And we've decided as an apostolate, for ecumenical reasons, to change the name for an unforeseen amount of time to Calvinist Answers Live. The phone number will stay the same, 31-TRUTH, 888-31-TRUTH, but we'll call it today Calvinist Answers Live. Our guest has a doctorate in the theology and life of John Calvin. His name's Dr. David Anders. So we welcome him to Calvinist Answers Live. But before we do that, I must in conscience drop the other foot and say Happy Halloween. No, and Happy April Fool's Day to one and all. For real, David Anders is with us. But before I introduce David to the show, I want to kind of mention the second hour, which is an important hour as well on the show, because it's a chance for us to talk to our former bishop. His name is Bishop Salvatore Cordileone. He's now the Bishop of Oakland, California. We're going to talk about the defense of marriage. Bishop Cordileone was one of the founding leaders and architects, in a way, of Proposition 8 out here in California. So we'll talk about what's at stake in the battle over marriage, the traditional definition of marriage as the union of one man and one woman. That's hour two, 1-888-318-7884, 1-888-31-TRUTH. That's the toll-free phone number. So, John Calvin, the trouble with Calvinism. Our guest, David Anders, is a former Calvinist and a Protestant historian who has embraced the riches of the Catholic Church. David grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, and received a master's degree in Christian thought from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in 1995, and a Ph.D. in religious studies from the University of Iowa in 2002. The following year, he, along with his wife Jill and their 5 children, entered the fullness of the Catholic Church. He currently works in the financial world and is a regular contributor to the blog calledtocommunion.com and has been a frequent guest on radio and television. And we welcome David Anders to Catholic Answers Live. That part was actually serious. That really is your throng. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Good to have you.
It's good to be here.
I really like your contributions to Call to Communion. I think you combine rich theological truth with a kind of a nice accessible storytelling style. So thanks for keep writing what you're writing.
Well, I appreciate your saying that. Thank you very much.
Maybe we can start at the beginning and ask you how you first came across the name John Calvin and how you were introduced to his worldview and his brand of Christianity. I presume it was through a Presbyterian context?
Yes, thank you. I grew up in a Presbyterian church, PCA, the Conservative Evangelical Denomination, here in Birmingham, Alabama. And my father actually was the chairman of the church's apologetics committee. And so his job, along with the whole committee, was to convince people to be Presbyterians. And so on his bookshelf at home, we had the Institutes of the Christian Religion, which is John Calvin's magnum opus, as well as other Calvinist and Reformed theologians, Jonathan Edwards, John Murray, and a lot of household names for evangelicals. And so it was sort of something that was in the air growing up, and we always, Calvin was our man. We revered him. He was the exemplar of Christian thought, theology, and the Christian life. So kind of a myth and a symbol of everything that was supposed to be right about Christianity.
The quote from Charles Spurgeon, of course, was serious. It almost reads like an Onion news parody because of how august the description he gives of John Calvin. Among all those who have ever been born of women, there's not risen a greater than John Calvin. Not the Blessed Mother, not St. Paul.
Well, it goes right to the heart, I think, of something that's very characteristic of Reformed Church. Reformed is another word for Calvinist. that's a very heavy emphasis that the whole tradition puts on an intellectual approach to the faith, on theology, on learning, on knowledge. And, Catholics, of course, have wonderful theologians, but at the end of the day, it's about the holiness of life. In the Reformed tradition, they really put a heavy emphasis on the intellectual component. And I have to admit, Calvin, even though I disagree with him today, was a tremendous intellectual. He had an amazing mind, and he could write a 100-page book in 2 days, and his output was tremendous. So for someone who is a Calvinist, Calvin produced a substantial body of work that's very impressive for its intellectual rigor.
One of the things that comes up as a theme when Christians of a Calvinist bent call this show is the issue of what we would call double predestination.
Oh, sure.
How did John Calvin develop that, and how do I put this the right way? The idea that people should be encouraged to pray and worship God even though they may be foreordained to eternal hell is hard for this Catholic to swallow and even understand. How did the doctrine develop in his own theology? Sure.
Well, Calvin really inherited the doctrine from Luther. I mean, Luther held to a very strong doctrine of predestination, even though later Lutherans softened the doctrine. But it fit well into Calvin's whole worldview. He wanted to safeguard the absolute sovereignty of God in the process of salvation and to remove any possibility that human works or human merit could contribute anything to one's eternal state, which, of course, is a key Protestant element, justification by faith alone, not by works or merit. So it fit right into that system. Now, one of the things I discovered as I was studying Calvin, and Calvin started to write in the 1530s, and he continued to write all the way into the 1560s. And as you trace the development and the growth of his writings on predestination, you'll find that it takes up a greater and greater amount of his thought as he moves along, particularly in his sermons and in his letters. And he finds it to be a very convenient doctrine for explaining why so many people disagreed with him. And when you dig into Calvin, one of the things that you learn is he could be kind of a caustic individual, not necessarily someone you want to be chummy with. And there were a lot of controversies in Geneva where he lived, people opposing him, and eventually he found that he could just sort of relegate all of those opponents to the realm of the reprobate or the damned. Oh, you must be predestined to hell. That's why you don't see things the way I'm teaching them.
Not unlike Luther in the caustic department. Luther could be quite acid penned, if you will.
Oh, absolutely.
How else did Calvin differ from Luther theologically?
Well, one of the things that you have to understand about the whole Reformed tradition, when Luther came along, his major concern was this quest for personal assurance and a personal encounter with Christ that would soothe his troubled conscience. Luther really was a very scrupulous soul, very kind of tortured conscience. And so his whole view of the Reformation, his view of the Scriptures was wanting to have this sort of unfettered encounter with Christ in the Bible. But he had an emphasis on an interior experience, kind of a mystical experience, and that was his theological background as well. He had been schooled in medieval mysticism. In Switzerland and in France, the Reformation took a completely different turn, and you find that there was a much greater emphasis on the Bible, not solely as a place of encounter with Christ, but as sort of a blueprint for the total reform of church and society, and a much more radical application of the doctrine of sola scriptura. So whereas Luther was willing to tolerate images in the churches and ceremonies and vestments that were reminiscent of Catholicism, the Reformed theologians, Zwingli as well as Calvin and others, wanted to rid the churches of anything that couldn't be found explicitly in the Bible. So get rid of all images, get rid of ceremonies, and a much more radical approach.
Sure. If you've just joined us, this is Catholic Answers Live. My name is Patrick Coffin. Our guest this hour is ex-Calvinist, now Catholic, Dr. David Anders. And the toll-free phone number to reach Dr. Anders with your question is 1-888-31-TRUTH. We're talking about the legacy of John Calvin and the trouble with Calvinism. 1-888-318-7884. Dr. Anders, there's so much to talk about here. Let me jump to something that I think American listeners will find interesting, and that is Calvin's allergy to the whole idea of a separation between church and state. He really saw them as hand and glove, did he not?
Well, actually, Calvin differed from other Reformed theologians in this. in Zurich, for example, where Zwingli was working, he was content to allow the state to run the church. He wanted the magistrates to have the final say on matters doctrinal and theological. Calvin differed from earlier Reformed theologians in really wanting the church to have the upper hand. And so he wanted very much to have the independence of the ministers from the state, but he wanted the state to support the decision of the ministers. So they worked hand in glove, but he saw them as separate institutions, with himself being the head of the Church of Geneva as really sort of the top dog.
The other issue is the timing of his debut on history's stage. You could call him a second-generation reformer. Would that be accurate?
Yes, that would be very accurate.
Did he write about the divisions he saw in his own lifetime, and did he ever reflect on maybe a terrible genie's been let out of its bottle?
That is one of the most interesting things about Calvin studies in my mind, that Luther had no idea what he was letting out of the bottle when he started the Protestant Reformation, and very shortly thereafter, in the early 1520s, things just sort of exploded in France and Switzerland, with people kind of running wild, teaching all kinds of doctrines, iconoclasm, breaking churches, breaking images, and then of course there was a radical disagreement within the Protestant camp about what Scripture actually taught, and this was very disturbing to Calvin. And in his earliest writings, he goes right after it and attacks it, and in 1549, for example, he complained. He says that every state of life has its own gospel, and they all forge it for themselves according to their own appetites. So there's a great diversity between the gospel of the court and the gospel of justices and lawyers and merchants, as there is between coins of different denominations. And he just saw that what we would today call denominationalism was anathema to Calvin.
The number, once again, toll-free, 1-888-31-TRUTH. Our guest, Dr. David Anders, ex-Calvinist, Christian, now fully in the bosom of the Catholic Church. We're talking about the legacy of John Calvin. Dr. Anders, one thing that is striking to people who are raised in a Presbyterian or Reformed or Calvinist background is the relative gap between the beliefs of Calvin and the beliefs of contemporary, even Calvinist theologians. Talk a little bit about that disparity.
Well, one of the things that eventually helped me on my way to the Catholic Church was I had grown up an evangelical Protestant in a system of religion that I think is probably very familiar to a lot of our listeners. You have to be born again, Bible alone, faith alone, a real tolerance for diversity between denominations as long as you hold to the so-called essentials. Right, this is all very typical of modern Protestantism in America. When I dug into Calvin, the first thing I found was here was a man who was utterly intolerant of theological diversity. He thought that all Protestants should believe precisely the same thing. He had no tolerance for this idea that there were essentials and non-essentials of the faith, things that today Protestants would be very eager to disagree on, like the nature of the Eucharist, for example. Calvin could actually write in 1541 that a proper understanding of the Eucharist is necessary for salvation. Now, his understanding wasn't Catholic, it was heretical, but nevertheless, the fact that he saw that as a doctrine that was essential for salvation, couldn't tolerate disagreement on it. And then, of course, he did have a much higher view of the sacraments and of church authority than most Protestants do today. So he wasn't Catholic, but he tilted a lot more Catholic than your modern Protestant does.
So while he would not get behind the Bishop of Rome, there was a kind of a strong ecclesiastical theme in his writings. He was not anti-church authority per se.
On the contrary, he was very much in favor of what he considered to be rightly constituted church authority. That basically meant the authority of Calvin. But he spent a great deal of his time arguing precisely for very, very high view of pastoral leadership, pastoral authority, and that it was the role of ministers and teachers to define the doctrines of the faith and the role of laity to submit and obey.
Well, that's a nice moment to pause on and come back after these few words. We'll take your calls, ladies and gentlemen, with Dr. David Anders, former Calvinist, Protestant historian, now Catholic writer. Check out, you give your website out, Dr. Anders?
Check out calledtocommunion.com.
Very good. Called, the word called to the numeral or T-O?
called TO Communion.
Okay, very good.
They can also go to calvintocatholic.com, which is my personal website.
Okay, and that is the numeral 2.
That's the numeral 2.
Okay, very good. The toll-free phone number is 1-888-31-TRUTH. You're listening to Catholic Answers Live. We're talking with Dr. David Anders about the legacy of John Calvin. It's quite a wide and broad legacy in capturing Scotch-Irish Presbyterians, the Puritans, and many more of the Reformed Presbyterian tradition. This is Catholic Answers Live. Coming up next, after these words, your calls. Stick around.
Get on board now to speak with Patrick and his guest on Catholic Answers Live.
Since its release in November 2010, Jimmy Akin's book, The Fathers Know Best, has sold thousands of copies. In fact, it's on its way to becoming a runaway bestseller. Together with its companion blog at thefathersknowbest.com and a series of videos on Catholic Answers YouTube channel, The Fathers Know Best has become the teaching tool when it comes to educating Catholics and non-Catholics alike on the crucial role the Fathers played in the history of the Church. Now when you order Jimmy's book, The Fathers Know Best, we'll include in your shipment a copy of his outstanding book, The Salvation Controversy, absolutely free. Take advantage of this limited-time offer now by dialing 888-291-8000 or by logging on to Catholic.com. In The Fathers Know Best, Jimmy Akin explores the earliest Christian writings like no one else can. In fact, the Church Fathers have always been important to Jimmy as they helped him study his way into the Catholic Church many years ago. Remember, a free copy of The Salvation Controversy will be added to your order when you purchase Jimmy Akin's best-selling book, The Fathers Know Best. Make the call before this offer expires at 888-291-8000 or click on the Shop tab at Catholic.com.
Join us this July for our Catholic Answers 2011 Apologetics Cruise to Alaska. Visit CatholicAnswersCruise.com to find out more.
The Catholic Answers Minute. I'm Father Vincent Serpa. In Mark 12:28, when a scribe asked Jesus for the first of all commandments, he answered, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself." In this, Jesus was emphasizing the superiority of the inner spiritual and moral life over external observance. When the scribe understood and agreed with him in this, Jesus said to him, "You are not far from the kingdom of God." So with us. Take liturgy for an example. Many are the skirmishes over liturgical observance and abuse these days. No matter how legitimate one's concerns may be, one's behavior must remain charitable. Charity leaves, nothing of value remains. I'm Father Vincent Serpa for Catholic Answers, Catholic.com.
Call now with your question. 888-318-7884. This is Catholic Answers Live.
Welcome back to the show. Don't miss the second hour with Bishop Salvatore Corleone, the Bishop of Oakland, California, on the defense of marriage. What's at stake in the battle over the definition, legal and moral, of marriage. That's hour 2. We continue now with David Anders, the trouble with Calvinism, the legacy of John Calvin. Let's go to your calls now by saying hi to Sam in New York City, New York, listening on iTunes podcast. Hello, Sam. Welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's the first time I've called in ever.
You get the trumpet blast of love, Sam. Welcome.
Well, for us professional woodwind musicians, maybe you could have a saxophone playing a bebop lick or something.
I'll have to think about that. It's good. Yeah.
Now, anyway, the question is, a problem with Calvinism that I'm going through right now with my family. I've been Catholic. I grew up Catholic, and then when my wife and I married in graduate school, she was from the Presbyterian Church in America. And I wound up going to church there probably for the first 8 or 9 years of our marriage, and then subsequently my wife converted to Catholicism, thank God. And a couple of years ago, she decided to go back to the PCA, and her elders have been advising her that since I'm a papist, she should divorce me, and they'd have advised her to do that and given her their permission. And so I'm going through this now. And the thing that I have trouble arguing or debating with the elders of this session, as they call themselves, is the whole thing in the Westminster Catechism on marriage, which I think is 2425, states that there's only two grounds for divorce, like Christ said, adultery or willful desertion by an unbelieving spouse. But if that unbelieving spouse is willing to live, then there's no reason for divorce. Now, the Calvinists think, or the PCA people...
Sam in New York, you're asking a $1 million question. We've got a lot of other folks on the line, too. I think, Dr. Anderson, you get the heart...
Let me water it down, then.
Well, no, actually, I want you to substantify it up a little bit and just form it into a question he can answer.
Okay. How can I debate the people who think that Catholics are... not believers, and what references can I come up with that to argue with?
Sam, it might be more helpful to focus on the views of Calvin toward divorce versus the session your wife's dealing with. Also, Dr. Anders, maybe you can tell people who don't know what PCA stands for.
Oh, yes. There are multiple Presbyterian denominations around the country. A very conservative one is the Presbyterian Church in America, PCA. Now, with respect to Calvin and divorce, first of all, my heart goes out to you for your situation. I'm really sorry. I mean, that's very difficult. As far as the practical issue of how are you going to convince them that that you're a believer or that you should be, treated with dignity, this is going to be a difficult question. I mean, we're talking with the whole problem of Catholic apologetics, and the problem you run into with most Presbyterians is Calvin himself and Luther treated the Catholic Church as the Antichrist. I mean, you're just defined out of redemption from the get-go, and they're not open to discussion except on their terms. So it's a hard sell. Now, you could send them to the website. We got a lot of ex-Calvinists at Call to Communion, and they've written extensively, precisely on just these issues, aimed just at Presbyterians and Calvinists addressing their concerns. So go check out our resources. Now, one thing I'd like to say about Calvin and divorce that's interesting, a lot of people don't know. Of course, the Catholic Church says no divorce. There's no such thing as Christian divorce. Annulment is not divorce. Okay, if you marry a baptized Christian, it's until death do you part. And it was the Protestants who introduced this idea of legitimate Christian divorce, and it was Calvin. It was Calvin's Geneva where you first begin to find actual Christian divorces taking place. There's a great book on the subject by the dean of all Calvin scholars, a fellow by the name of Robert Kingdon, called Adultery and Divorce in Calvin's Geneva. And it's a scholarly work, but it's very interesting on that topic.
Sure.
And, Luther, interestingly, abhorred divorce, and he was consulted one time on whether a man should divorce his wife, and as actually a Landgrave, a noble, who wanted to take a mistress and get rid of his wife, and Luther said better that he should practice polygamy than divorce his wife.
I'm familiar with that.
Sure. But Calvin opened the door to divorce. Interestingly, Calvin, on another social issue, Calvin also opened the door on usury, which was something the Catholic Church had always taken a dim view of, money lending. And Calvin wrote the first modern justification of loaning money at interest. And, that's another interesting topic.
Sam, you're asking a really broad and simultaneously broad and deep question. Have you seen Father Ron Ticelli and Peter Craif's book, Handbook of Catholic Apologetics?
Yes, but that's on my list to purchase. It seems like I need to purchase it ASAP.
Well, it's very good. Dr. Craif's other book is also good, Fundamentals of the Faith, because he contrasts the Protestantisms with Catholicism on faith and faith, works, grace, and that whole thing.
Yeah, I think Dr. Ken Howell wrote something like that. My wife and I went to his church when he was a Protestant minister.
Wow, interesting.
So I think he wrote something on that, but it's not published anymore.
Well, you've got our prayers, Sam, and keep close to us, okay? We'd love to hear back from you. And you might enjoy the second hour with Bishop Corleone on the defense of marriage, if you're looking for ammo on the scriptural evidence for the indissolubility of marriage.
Thanks a lot, guys.
All right, God bless, Sam.
For you.
Thank you, sir. Thanks for calling from the Big Apple. Let's go now to Jack in Leesville, Alabama, listening on Covenant Radio. Hello, Jack.
Hello, thank you for listening. My question is, doesn't the doctrine of salvation by faith alone, which is characterized by that question, have you been saved, wouldn't that work if it was united with purgatory? if you had a minute, I can explain how my thought process.
No, I think you get it, Dr. Anderson.
I think I get it. Let me answer it this way. We know that salvation by faith alone is an unscriptural doctrine. We're the only place that faith alone is used in the New Testament, is when St. James tells us that we're not justified by faith alone. And, of course, the Church Fathers knew nothing of this doctrine, and St. Paul knew nothing of it either. However, there is one sense in which we can talk about the instrumental power of faith in justification where we can find some common ground with Protestants, and it's this, that it is through faith that we are made partakers of the body of Christ, participants in the covenant of redemption in this life. And it is entirely an act of God's grace that brings us into the church and introduces us to all the means of grace and of salvation. We don't merit that. We don't earn that. That's entirely God's gracious gift to us. Now, we have to then cooperate with that grace and continue to cooperate with it and persevere until death in order to be saved. But that initial justification, that initial grace that we're given, is entirely of God's graciousness towards us, and we don't earn that. So in that sense, our initial justification is by the sacraments and by faith alone, not by our own merits. But our final justification, as St. Paul so clearly says in Romans chapter 2, God gives glory, honor, and immortality to those who persevere in good works until the end.
Jack,
sins,
go ahead.
And following that, be united to Christ's sacrifice on the cross with its infinite merits, with infinite mercy, infinite power, all the perfections of God.
Jack, could you say Jack, we missed the first part. Could you repeat that, please?
Well, after you make the statement, I'm saved, and you confess, you believe in your heart, then they say, okay, the sins are all united to Christ on the cross and His infinite perfections, which overwhelm all your sins. So, but I thought, well, we took the apple in our mouths when Adam and Eve, so we're under the yoke of having to know of knowledge. So then that means that even if all of my horrible sins, from the moment I made the statement, I unite them to Christ on the cross, but then I have to go to purgatory because I'm ordained or whatever from Adam and Eve that I must know. So I have to know how much suffering I produced by all of my sins. Okay. So in that sense, I'm going to suffer, which goes against.
Of course, it's an interesting question, Jack. I knew a guy, a seminarian at St. Charles Borromeo, who wrote the Congregation for the Causes of Saints this question: do the people who are canonized suffer in purgatory? And the answer came back, no. At death, they've had their purgatory here below. They die in that mystical union with Christ. So it's kind of a Catholic tradition that purgatory is not required of anybody. God really wants us with Him in the fullness of His kingdom. Dr. Anders?
Well, it's an interesting question. It's not the Catholic doctrine of purgatory, and of course, it's not the Protestant view either. Now, I think. Let me throw out, when you were talking about uniting yourself to Christ and the infinite merits of His sacrifice. Clearly, Christ's sacrifice is infinite in its merit, but this idea that
because I don't want to interrupt, I'm sorry, but just think of the tidal wave of sin, of all the abortions, of the let's say priests have done grave sin. So is it possible even everyone to go to confession? It's not. There's too many people that have sinned. There's not enough priests. I don't even think there's enough time.
Yeah, Jack, we're getting really far afield here from our topic, which is the legacy of Calvin. I would recommend you call back on a open forum, which is coming up on Tuesday, Q&A open forum, or if you're not Catholic, that would be Monday. We have a double-hour open forum for non-Catholics, but we have to move on. I'm sorry. I hope that was a help. It is 30 minutes after the hour. We're going to go now to Patrick in Washington, Washington, listening on 100.7 FM, KHSS Radio. Hello, Patrick.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep. Are you on a cell phone?
Yes.
Okay. If you're driving, it's better to pull over.
Okay. My question is: was Martin Luther and John Calvin at the same era of time, and did they both work together to try to split the Catholic Church, and or do something in that
Yeah, we covered that a little bit at the top of the show. Dr. Anders, they're not exactly contemporaries, are they?
No, Luther was born in the 1480s. Calvin wasn't born until 1509. They overlapped, but Calvin was Luther's younger contemporary. Luther knew of Calvin. Calvin, of course, knew of Luther, had great regard for him. But they were not exactly the same time, and they were different geographical areas.
Thank you, Patrick, for that. This is Catholic Answers Live. Our guest, Dr. David Anders, The Trouble with Calvinism, the Legacy of John Calvin. Let's go now to Eamon in Washington, D.C., listening on 1160 AM Guadalupe Radio. Eamon, welcome, sir.
Hey, I really appreciate you saying my name right. I really love your show. I don't always agree with you, but 99% of the time I agree with you.
We've got 99% coverage.
Yeah, that's good, right?
I don't even agree with 99% of the things I say. That's good.
Now, I attended a seminary briefly in the 80s, and I had a professor who was a fascinating scholar, and he had written his dissertation on John Calvin and Augustine, and he talked a lot about how Augustine had that Calvin, really admired Augustine, but he was very, very careful about which parts he picked. He cherry-picked of Augustine when he did his writings. I was just wondering if we could talk about that at all, and how Augustine was kind of abused by John Calvin.
Sure. Thanks for the question. That's a very good question, and I like it because exploring this topic, this exact question, is what ultimately led me to become a Catholic, because I had grown up with Calvin and this idea that Calvin and Luther were merely recovering the doctrine of Augustine, that the early church had allegedly been more similar to Protestantism, and medieval Catholicism had departed from the pristine purity of the early church, and it was up to the reformers to recover it. And of course, they always pointed to Augustine as their big hero from the first 4 centuries. When I actually began to read Augustine extensively, I realized that Augustine was wholly Catholic. His view of justification was Catholic, his view of salvation, his view of the church, his view of the sacraments. He just was not a Protestant. And that realization sort of shook me to my core, to my foundations, and ultimately started the process that brought me into the church. One thing you have to understand about Augustine, in his role in the whole process of Western theology, is that in the 16th century, Augustine was universally revered as the doctor of the faith among Catholics, among Protestants. And if you wanted to argue something, you really had to relate it back to Augustine. All right, he had such stature. And so you're right, Calvin and Luther both were highly selective in the way they quoted Augustine. They quoted him polemically, but they quoted him all the time. And this particular area of research, Calvin's use of Augustine, has received a lot of study. There have been massive tomes on the subject. Calvin knew Augustine, but you're correct. He was selective in his use and polemical in his use.
Eamon, appreciate the call very much. Love to hear back from you on a Q&A open forum to hear about that 1% disagreement. That'll be kind of tantalizing, but we're so glad to hear from you today. Let's go to Brooklyn, New York now. Listening on EWTN Sirius Satellite Radio, we say hi to Rosa. Hey, Rosa, welcome.
Hey. Thank you. Thank you for taking my call. My question is predestination. From what I understand, according to Calvin, predestination is something that God does from the beginning of time, and as far as I know, that is against free will. In other words, how can I have free will to love God and to choose Him freely if I know that I'm going to be predestined to be saved? So my question is, how do they justify that? The Calvinists, that somebody sitting next to each other, one may be predestined for salvation and another one not.
Well, Rosa, thank you for the question. It's an excellent question. And, of course, the answer is that they don't justify it. They are not interested in free will. And Luther actually wrote a book in 1525 called On the Bondage of the Will, where he denies the doctrine of the freedom of the will. Calvin wasn't as eager to use that language of the denial of free will, but in substance he held the same thing, that the will is not free. Now, of course, this is condemned by the Council of Trent, and the whole history of Catholic theology teaches that we do have a free will. But that will still needs the grace of God in order to attain salvation. So our freedom of will doesn't enable us to to earn God's merit apart from grace. All right. So you're correct that we have to have free will.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Rosa. Appreciate the call. Okay, it's about 35 after. Time for another pause on this first hour of this Friday edition of Catholic Answers Live. My name is Patrick Coffin. Our guest is Dr. David Anders, former Calvinist. We're talking about the legacy of Calvin, his theology, his ecclesiology. If you're Calvinist or not, Catholic or not, we'd love to hear from you on the influence of Calvin. And we're kind of poring over what his worldview was and lining it up with Catholic teaching. 1-888-31-TRUTH, 1-888-318-7884. That's the toll-free number. It's 36 after the hour. Coming up next, much more on Catholic Answers Live.
From Minneapolis to Memphis, Catholic Answers Live. Since its release in November 2010, Jimmy Akin's book, The Fathers Know Best, has sold thousands of copies. In fact, it's on its way to becoming a runaway bestseller. Together with its companion blog at thefathersknowbest.com and a series of videos on Catholic Answers' YouTube channel, The Fathers Know Best has become the teaching tool when it comes to educating Catholics and non-Catholics alike on the crucial role the Fathers played in the history of the Church. Now, when you order Jimmy's book, The Fathers Know Best, we'll include in your shipment a copy of his outstanding book, The Salvation Controversy, absolutely free. Take advantage of this limited-time offer now by dialing 888-291-8000 or by logging on to Catholic.com. In The Fathers Know Best, Jimmy Akin explores the earliest Christian writings like no one else can. In fact, the Church Fathers have always been important to Jimmy as they helped him study his way into the Catholic Church many years ago. Plus, in your free copy of his book, The Salvation Controversy, you'll learn to master the finer points of the all-important discussion of how we're saved, whether or not we can lose our salvation, what role works play in salvation, and much more. Remember, a free copy of The Salvation Controversy will be added to your order when you purchase Jimmy Akin's best-selling book, The Fathers Know Best. Make the call before this offer expires at 888-291-8000 or click on the Shop tab at Catholic.com.
Catch Catholic Answers Live anytime in the archive section of Catholic.com.
It gets harder and harder all the time to find like-minded people who share your values and interests, whatever they may be. Whether you're a teen who wants to meet other teens who share your faith, a vegetarian looking to meet up with others who've made that choice, a bookworm who wants to find out what others are reading, you name it. You'll find a safe place to meet up with fellow Catholics in your area when you log on to Catholic.com and check out the Catholic Answers social groups. You can begin to network with local Catholics or start a group of your own. Our social groups offer advanced social networking features like dedicated group pages, comment walls, group forums, photo albums, multiple privacy settings, and a lot more. In the Catholic Answers social groups, you can share photos, coordinate school and church projects, create a custom personal profile, and even ask our staff apologists your faith questions. Log on and start networking today at Catholic.com. Call now with your question, 888-318-7884. This is Catholic Answers Live.
We're back. The legacy of Calvin with ex-Calvinist Dr. David Anders. During the break, Dr. Anders, we were talking about the historical time and how Calvinism worked in the concrete political sphere. And I was thinking about another great saint from that era and that area, St. Francis de Sales. How contemporary were those two?
Francis de Sales lived after Calvin by about one generation. He did know Calvin's successor in Geneva, who was Theodore Beza.
Beza, okay.
And de Sales, of course, was the titular bishop of Geneva, though he never got to visit his diocese because he would have been run out of town. Mm-hmm. But he was one of the best anti-Calvinist apologists in the history of the Church and was personally responsible for bringing tens of thousands of Calvinists back to the Catholic faith. Anyone who hasn't read his book, Catholic Controversies by St. Francis de Sales, should absolutely get a hold of it and read it. It's wonderful anti-Calvinist apologetics.
Well, interesting. I've seen the title many times. I've reread Introduction to the Devout Life. That's a good book recommendation then. All right, let's go to the Northwest, to Laurel, Maryland, and say hi to Stuart, listening on WMET, 1160 AM. Hello, Stuart.
Stewart, and I'm nowhere near the Northwest. I'm Washington, D.C. But
sorry.
Okay.
You know, when I say cake when I mean pie, and I say Northeast is what my brain meant to say. So thanks for the correction, Stewart.
Okay.
In Laurel.
Okay. This past Saturday, I was 40 Days for Life. We were leafleting for our local for the local abortion clinic, making people aware, and went to a house, and the gentleman answered the door. I told him about the prayer vigil, and then he said, "Oh, I'm on the same page with you. He said, I'm a strict Calvinist." That's what he said. I'm a strict Calvinist. And yes, I'm on the same page. He took the information. As I was walking away, I'm a recent convert. So what you said earlier about double predestination, it's very confusing to me. I wanted to go back and ask him, how does that abortion? I don't know whether did Calvin have a view on abortion? Is there a Calvinistic view on abortion or contraception?
Well, that's a very good question. Now, Calvin, even though he permitted divorce, he took a dim view of divorce, and the Protestants did have a higher view of marriage than is common among Protestants today. The Reformers did. And they also had a pretty dim view of any kind of sexual activity that would have, fallen outside the bounds of God's intended design. Very dim. In fact, they executed people, death penalty for this kind of thing. So they had a very dim view of abortion. They had a very dim view of contraception. Now, of course, in 500 years, the Calvinist tradition has weakened in its opposition to contraception, to the point that today I think you would be hard-pressed to find, there are some still, but you'd be hard-pressed to find many Calvinists that oppose contraception, although I do know some.
Okay, that might have been what he meant by he was a strict Calvinist. I thought I was taken aback when he said that. I would have been taken aback if he would have identified himself as a Calvinist.
Gotcha.
He didn't say Presbyterian or anything. I said that's great. And okay, thank you very much.
Stuart, thanks for calling from the Northeast. Appreciate it. Thanks for the call. Let's go to Stephen now. In the South, Mobile, Alabama, listening on 1410 AM WNGL Radio. Hello, Stephen in Mobile.
Hello, how are you?
Good, sir. Welcome to the show.
All right. Listen, my question was about ritual and, talk, that kind of talk that you had earlier about the Reformers not wanting, vestments and all ritual. The question is, why is that not biblical when it's all throughout the Old Testament? I don't.
Interesting question. Yeah, very liturgical religion. Judaism wasn't it not?
Oh yeah, certainly.
Go ahead.
That's an excellent question. And by the way, Stephen, I was just in Mobile last week, and I visited your cathedral down there. You have an absolutely beautiful cathedral, oldest church in Alabama, I think, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
The interesting thing on this is that the Calvinists are really not consistent. They're not. I mean, this is. I think you have to go back and look at the historical circumstances that in which this theology emerged. In the 16th century, there was a tremendous opposition on the part of people in the cities, in particular, to clerical privilege, to the perceived wealth and the perceived alleged corruption of the church. And so when the Reformation happened in France and Switzerland in particular, it took the form not so much of an insistence on doctrine, but as iconoclasm, attacks on symbols of Catholic power or ritual or devotion, especially attacks on the Mass. So you have the famous affair of the placards in Francis I's reign, where they go and desecrate elements of the Mass and tear down statues, and so this kind of attitude of anti-clericalism has a lot to do with the way the theology develops. And then they look for biblical justification for these things. But, of course, the Calvinist tradition over time is not consistent. So, for example, in Zurich, they come to the conclusion that you shouldn't have musical instruments in church. because they don't see musical instruments in the New Testament. Of course, there's plenty of musical instruments in the Old Testament. In Geneva, they come up with the idea that the only songs that you can legitimately sing in worship are the Psalms of David. But then you can move to other parts of the Reformed world and find that they don't hold to those standards. One of the most interesting contradictions in the Calvinist attitude towards ritual, Calvin, he absolutely abhorred the Catholic practice of private baptisms. When people would, have a priest to their estate or whatever and have a child baptized in their home, as opposed to doing it in front of the congregation for Sunday worship. And Calvin went on and on and on about how you absolutely cannot have private baptisms. Baptisms have to take place in the context of the whole congregation. And he justifies this and everything else by saying we have to stick strictly to what Scripture teaches. But of course, if you go look at the actual baptisms that take place in the New Testament, none of them happened in the context of a Sunday liturgy. Every single one was outdoors. Peter's preaching at Pentecost, or the disciples of John the Baptist, or Paul, is in a private home when he's baptized. And so it's just flat inconsistent. But I always get a kick out of that one.
How's that, Stephen? Stephen in Mobile?
Yeah, well, that's amazing. I agree with that business about the baptisms. I've seen that and heard that. It's fascinating. I got to read now. I got to read Desales. I guess.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. That's. I'm glad you brought that up again. Francis Desales, S-A-L-E-S. I like to say he's the patron of shopping. The book is he? Catholic Controversies, the name of the book. Stephen, great question. Thanks for calling tonight.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Right.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye. 47 after the hour. We do have a few moments left with our guest, ex-Calvinist, now Roman Catholic, David Anders, Ph.D. The phone number is toll-free, 1-888-31-TRUTH, talking about Calvinism and the legacy of John Calvin, 1-888-318-7884. In the meantime, we say say hi to Joe in Jacksonville, Florida, listening on 1460 AM, Queen of Peace Radio. Hello, Joe in Jacksonville.
Well, hey. Thank you for taking my call. And if this is already, I'm coming late to the show, so if it's already been mentioned, I can probably you inventory these sessions on your website, right?
Yep,
my question is, you allude to Calvin in Zurich. It's kind of it's a controlled environment. Then what happens to Calvinism as it disseminates throughout the earth and it takes various forms, and then certain practices are adhered to, and then it splinters out. Could you, I'm sure you go into great detail in your book, but could you kind of outline that for me? Because I'm engaged in a conversation with a Calvinist, and I just kind of want to maybe be able to not push back, but just offer that up as maybe something for him to consider, and I'll stop talking.
Absolutely. It's a great question, and since it covers so much ground, let me just focus on one issue, okay? And it's this issue of the assurance of salvation and how you know you're a Christian. Calvin, like the Catholic theologians before him, had a very high view, not a Catholic view, but a high view of baptism as the beginning of the Christian life. Calvin did not know anything about this idea of praying to receive Christ and being born again, and hey, brother, have you been born again? He knew nothing about that at all. Okay, you don't find it anywhere in Calvin. So where does it come from? Well, Calvin thought that you should identify people as Christians by the fact that they were baptized in communion with the church and submission to church authority. But when Calvinism moves out of Geneva into countries where it's not established, like France, and especially in England, where the state church was Protestant but not explicitly Calvinist, that whole model of identifying yourself as a Christian becomes impossible, because there is no Calvinist hierarchy for you to obey. There is no Calvinist sacraments for you to participate in. And so instead, people get very interested in the doctrine of predestination and start looking for these interior signs of am I elect? Am I one of the predestined? And since I can't identify myself by the sacraments, I start looking for these affective, emotional criteria, and eventually that in Puritanism, that morphs into this doctrine of born-againism, which finally emerges in the 18th century. Now, it leads you in a direction that is so radically different than anything Calvin himself would have countenanced, and yet ultimately, it's a development of some Calvinist themes in a place that he had no knowledge of.
Joe, does that shed some light, Joe?
Oh, man. What's the name of your book?
Go to the website, calledtocommunion.com. I've got an article on there called How John Calvin Made Me a Catholic, and we go into some of these details.
I'm sorry, calledtocommunion.com?
Calledtocommunion.com.
Got it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Joe. Appreciate the call. We go from Joe to George in Concord, New Hampshire, listening on Sirius EWTN, Sirius Satellite Radio. Hello, George. Welcome.
Hello, gentlemen. Question I have, this is always a stumbling block for most Protestants, they sort of ignore the whole reason why we go to Mass, basically, is the Eucharist. What was Calvin's view on that? Was it similar to most Protestants, that it doesn't really matter?
What a great question. No, Calvin actually had a much stronger view of the Eucharist than is common among Protestants today. He didn't hold the Catholic doctrine, but of course, Luther held to a realist conception of Christ's presence, not transubstantiation, but what was later called consubstantiation. Early Reformed theologians like Zwingli thought of the Eucharist as just a symbol. Calvin tried to find a middle ground. He wanted to hold that Christ's body and blood were made spiritually available to the believer, but not to the unbeliever, and so that there was a real communion that took place in the sacrament, but a spiritual communion. And he had a very high view of this, and he thought it was really necessary for salvation, and a proper understanding of this doctrine was necessary for salvation, and that exclusion from the sacrament was tantamount to a decree of damnation or reprobation. And he would counsel people to look to the sacraments for assurance of their salvation when you read his interviews with people. So he had a high view of the Eucharist, not as high as the Catholic Church, but a lot higher than what you would find today.
George in Concord, thanks for the call. Let's go to Lisa in Rochester, New York, listening on 1460 AM. Hello, Lisa. Welcome.
Hi, I'm just listening, and I don't know anything about the background of Calvinism, but just hearing about the contradictions with the Bible, like you were pointing out with baptism, not being in the church or being in the church, and there just sound like so many contradictions. I'm just wondering, what was his motivation? Like, what was his driving reason to make all these statements and doctrines?
It's
it doesn't sound like it was really biblical.
It's a great question,
isn't it?
And I think the best way to explain it is you have to look at the 1520s and the 1530s as kind of like the 1960s in America. There was an era where there was this sort of revolutionary fervor of we're going to overthrow the old system, the ancien régime, as it were, and new things are afoot. And it seemed there was this ethos that Protestantism was the happening thing, the modern thing, and Catholicism, was the old fogey traditional that was moribund and full of corruption. And Calvin bought right into that. He was into what seemed to be the new intellectual currents of the day, and he had a very high view of himself. He was kind of an arrogant man, and so I think, quite frankly, he didn't want to submit to people that he didn't personally respect, and he thought he would just do a better job running the show.
His ego?
He was tremendously egotistical. I've read thousands and thousands of pages of Calvin, letters, sermons, personal anecdotes. I don't ever remember him apologizing, ever admitting that he was wrong about anything. He was always had to be right about everything.
That's very interesting. Lisa, I would recommend a tape series on CD called Inside the Protestant Mind. John Calvin's the main title. It's by Kenneth Hensley. You can get it at St. Joseph's Communications. He kind of goes into this kind of family of origin psychological profile of John Calvin and how that ended up being painted onto a universal canvas. Lisa in Rochester, appreciate your time very much. And also, Dr. David Anders, thank you so much for joining us today on Catholic Answers Live. I learned an awful lot, so thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And going back to Calvin's roots, I would say, merci beaucoup, monsieur.
Pas du tout.
Okay, talk to you again. Coming up next, Bishop of Oakland, California, His Excellency Salvatore Corleone. The defense of marriage is our topic in Hour 2. What's at stake in the debate over the definition of marriage? Is it just a Catholic thing, just a religious thing, or is there much more at stake in that debate? Coming up, Hour 2, Bishop Salvatore Corleone on marriage here on Catholic Answers Live. Stick around.